Welcome to episode 18 of the David Bernard Podcast with Zach Fradella. Today we are going to be talking to two veteran journalists, John Snell and Rob Krieger, both of Fox 8. Of course, one is more senior than the other. I don't think John is going to mind me saying that he has a few years on Rob and, a lot of years on you, Zach, and even a couple on me. But let me tell you, there is nothing that can replace local experience like that of John Snell. And for that matter, Rob Krieger, a local New Orleanian who's been covering Southeast Louisiana news and weather events now for the better part of 2 decades. And we're going to use their knowledge and their thoughts to discuss Hurricane Ida. Rob spent days immediately after the storm making his way into devastated communities, particularly in the river and bayou parishes, and mainly outside the levee-protected areas under some very difficult circumstances. How he got in and out of those areas was really pretty precarious at times. So we're going to hear his stories and get his perspective on where the recovery effort is right now. And of course, we're also going to be turning to John Snell, who has been reporting on in the environmental crisis along the Louisiana coastline ever since Hurricane Katrina, is an expert in everything as far as coastal restoration goes, levee protection, and anything involved down there with the marshes and also the swamp. So that's going to be coming up in a few minutes. But one thing we have been able to do is we have been able to finally catch a breath around here. The last couple of weeks in the tropics, really the entirety of the United States and the Gulf of Mexico, of course. There's been a lot of activity, Zach, but it's been out to sea.
Exactly. It's like finally, after Nicholas went away, things got better in the form of it's been so quiet locally. And we're now seeing the Atlantic quiet down. Now that we're moving into October, remember, this is what happens. The Atlantic starts to go quiet out in the mean development region off the coast of Africa, and we start to watch for things a little bit closer to home. But ever since Sam sort of shot itself in the North Atlantic, and speaking of Sam, what a storm Sam was, but it didn't impact any land, so was it really a big deal for us? No, but it did break quite a few records and set some kind of historical marks with some ace numbers. But we're quiet. And going into October, look, we always talked about this last year. Once you get past that first week of October, our chances of a major hurricane here in Louisiana go down considerably. Last year was totally different. But you have to always go back to climatology, and climatology says after that first week of October, the percentages of storms for us really quickly starts to diminish.
Yeah, I mean, Zeta was a definite outlier. In fact, Zeta is the strongest hurricane on record to strike the United States so late in the season. And so the chance of that repeating itself is awfully slim. Of course, we are in this era of warmer ocean waters, and we've seen these dramatic, rapidly intensifying storms in the Gulf. So you want to never say never, but you're right. We do have to revert to climatology. And with each passing week, the chance of a severe storm, at least, that continues to go down. Look, these two monster storms, Sam and Larry, in the Atlantic the last couple of weeks, it's incredible. And you mentioned ACE. That's accumulated cyclone energy, right? And so we measure ACE by how long a storm is alive out in the ocean and how intense it is. And you put those two things together, and that's how you get the ACE number. I was looking at Dr. Phil Klotzbach's feed of Colorado State University. Sam was a hurricane for 11 days. And that's the longest-lived Atlantic hurricane since Jose in 2017. And Sam, at least as of today, and it's unlikely to change because Sam is, finally non-tropical system, it's in 6th place for the most number of ACE points ever observed in the Atlantic. And that goes back to 1966 because of satellite records when we could really focus.
I think it went to 4th now. I was reading some of the latest tweets today, and it goes to show you how these things are, because the storm transitioned. The storm didn't hit land in a weekend. It transitioned into a non-tropical over North Atlantic, so there's a few more ACE points that was accumulated before that happened.
When it gets up there at the top, I mean, there's probably only a few points, right, that are separating all of these storms. So, wow, so maybe it's the 4th most points on record, but it passed up some really historic storms like Hurricane Allen in 1980 and Matthew in 2016. Also, I did some calculations last night, and if you look at the seasonal ACE so far for this year, the amount of accumulated cyclone energy of all the storms, Larry and Sam are over 60% of this season's ACE. We've had a lot of storms that have been like weak, kind of one day nothing storms out in the middle of the Atlantic. Just for perspective, Sam was around 53 ACE points. Maybe it's a little bit higher than that now. And Larry had 32. Ida is in third place with 10.8. And you're saying, well, wait a minute. Ida was a Category 4 storm. Why is the ACE number so low on this?
And that's because Ida lasted as a Category 4 for how long? 12 hours or so? Remember, it strengthened right at the coast. So that's the weird thing about ACE, and people get confused. They just see ACE as intensity, and if a storm's out in the middle of the Atlantic, it can have a tremendous amount of ACE, like Sam, that just was sustained that Category 4 status for a long time. It was a long track storm that we dealt with for 11 days. And that's the kind of storms we love because they get the energy up there. That energy has to go to the poles, but it stayed out to sea. It did not impact anybody. It didn't even really impact Bermuda, which is good news. And I think the most interesting tweet of Dr. Phil Klocksbach was how the ACE with Sam was more than, 14 full seasons? One storm this year produced more ACE units than 14 full hurricane seasons on record. That's crazy.
And we're glad that Sam stayed out to sea for that reason. Hey, I want to remind everybody that you can always listen to this podcast on your favorite podcast app in case you're watching it. And if you're listening to it, that's right, we have a video version as well. You can find that at fox8live.com/David. And a reminder, you can also reach the podcast through our Fox 8 weather apps that you can download to your favorite streaming devices. We have the podcast apps on our Fox 8 apps that you can get on Roku, Amazon Fire, and Apple TV, and all those kind of places. On that note, we're going to bring in our guest for today, who really don't need an introduction if you've been watching New Orleans TV for any length of time, but it's one that's worth the rest of our listeners to know a little bit about them. For those of you who are not in the New Orleans area, John Snell, he is the anchor. I'm going to call him the dean of TV news and the market. There's one or two others out there that we know about, but as far as I'm concerned, he is definitely one of the deans of local news now in New Orleans. He has been at Fox 8 since the early 1980s. I mean, he's covered everything from, he got here, they had the World's Fair in 1984. We had the collapse of the oil industry in the 1980s. He covered Governor Edwin Edwards, all of his trials, and too many hurricanes to count. But it was Katrina, Zach, in 2005 when he really started to focus his reporting on South Louisiana's storm protection, including all the natural features like our barrier islands, marshes, and swamps. And his continuing series is called Coast in Crisis. And you can find his reports. They're incredible reports that he does. Most of these all on his own at fox8live.com/Coast in Crisis. And Rob Krieger, he also anchors reports for the Fox 8 Morning Edition. He's been a reporter in Southeast Louisiana since 2008, beginning in Baton Rouge and then moving back to his native New Orleans here at Fox 8. 2008 was quite the year to start. That was Gustav in Baton Rouge, so he was thrown into the fire for sure. Gustav was a devastating storm for the Baton Rouge area, and he covered Ike that year, and he reported extensively in 2010 on the BP oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. So let's bring in today's guests, John Snell and Rob Krieger, for their perspective on Hurricane Ida. John and Rob, welcome to the podcast. Excited to have you both here today.
Great to be here.
Thanks for having us.
Well, let's get right to it. It's certainly been a month, a terrible month. I guess really a terrible year and a half if you consider all things around the pandemic and all these storms. But today we're going to talk about Ida and both of your experiences and what you observed during the storm, Rob, and what you guys have observed since the storm. On a personal note, though, how did both of you fare in the storm? John, let's start with you.
No, I'm very fortunate. I had a lot more issues in Katrina than in this one. I've got my wife said, yeah, the fan blade on the back porch broke, and I said, good. I never liked that fan anyway. And your heart really, we kind of, sometimes it's your turn, and I've had a couple of storms where it was my turn. This wasn't it. So we're very blessed. And when you drive, I'm sure Rob can tell you, when you drive into these areas, and you see just the utter life-changing devastation, it really is hard.
Rob, how about you?
I mean, it's really the same story for me. I live in Mid-City, New Orleans, so comparatively, the amount of damage that the folks got down in the bayou parishes, river parishes, tremendously, just a lot more. Our fence came down, and then I live in a double, so the neighbor next door lost some parts of the roof, some shingles, but really not something that was difficult to replace. So we're certainly thankful, for everything that we were able to go through. My biggest concern, and this sort of puts it in perspective, and David, because I was trying to get you to help take care of him, was my bearded dragon during the storm. He needed a light source and power, so I brought him here to the station so that if power did go out, which it did, he would be able to have his special light that keeps him alive. And then lo and behold, the power goes out here at the station. So thankfully, we had a lot of good players that were helping out with Dustin. So the little mascot of the storm running around.
I was not terribly excited about seeing him, but I'm glad that he fared in the storm. Reptiles and David are really not a good mix. Well, let's talk about the storm itself, guys, as it was happening. And Rob, let's start with you. Where were some of the locations you're reporting from actually when the storm was happening? Describe what those conditions were like, and then maybe compare it with other storms you've been in the middle of. I know last year you were in Laura.
Right. We started off in Homa. That's kind of where we, made our base for the duration of the storm. We went down to one of the lower fingers of Terrebonne. I believe it was down kind of near Bayou Duloc. One of the parish officials had taken us down there just to kind of get a look at how that surge potentially was going to be affecting the lower part of the parish. And it was just a whiteout condition when we got out of the car there. You were instantly soaked with rain coming all over from every which way, it felt like. And then the winds were just incredibly speedy coming through there. But then really, that was just the beginning of it. Hours later, we kind of hid out in the governmental building has a parking garage right next door, big concrete superstructure. So we felt pretty confident that was going to be a safe place to ride out, but still have a view of what was happening because so many people had evacuated and they, wanted to see what was going on. The wind coming through, I mean, if you're familiar with the way parking garages work, they have those big cuts open, kind of around, and the wind coming through those openings was just absolutely incredible. I was telling my friends, you see these, memes on the internet and, the weather guy that's like leaning into the wind while he's reporting on a storm. But I had experienced really high winds before, like you said, in Laura too, but the force of that wind, I had never experienced anything like that before, to where it blew you back. It was hard to stand up. It was hard to hear yourself think. And then the rain itself, which is those daggers, little bullets that were just hitting you because they were going so hard and so fast. So, we really rode it out there until we thought that the winds had kind of gotten down to a more manageable level. We began to drive through Homa, downtown Homa, and it was hard to make one block to the next just because everywhere you look, there was some form of damage, whether it was a tree down, power pole down, fences, siding, shingles, roofs off, everywhere you went, the roads were all completely blocked from one to the next. So it was a bit harrowing there, especially in the moments during and immediately after the storm.
Now, Rob, one question I have, because I know you went through Laura last year. I mean, you were at the casino there, so somewhat of a same structure. But
right.
Did from the length of time, did the length of time of Ida, which we know as meteorologists, we know that it was a much slower moving storm than Laura. Did you find the length of time was totally that big of a difference when the storm was actually going on?
It's Laura came through at night, so and Ida came through during the day. So the amount of time, it seemed like Ida was longer, especially because we were really kind of outside in it. We were for Laura, we were in the Golden Nugget Hotel, so we were kind of indoors for at least the initial part of it, and then as it started kind of coming through, we tried to make our way downstairs, try to find a safe spot, but we really had to shelter in place because of where we were. So it really did feel like it was slow, and we're sitting there staring at this radar with, it felt like it wasn't moving at all. It would shift. We kind of thought we were going to be in that eye wall and maybe get a piece of the eye as well, but then it shifted away from us, and the eye avoided us right at the last second, it felt like. But it really, was there forever, going into the night even, to where, as soon as the sun had gone down, I mean, the winds were still kicking through. It was still, a lot of damage, a lot of devastation for hours and hours on end, it felt like.
John, I want to ask you from an anchor perspective, and we're going to get into the post-storm damage and what the coastline looks like now in a little bit. But as you were covering this storm, how did it feel compared to other storms in the past? Did anything stand out? Did anything worry you more than other storms? Or did this feel like this was going to be different than, say, storms in the past?
Well, something Rob said kind of strikes me there before I get into that. And Rob talked about how it was a daytime storm. And correct me if I'm wrong, it was a daytime storm down on the coast where Rob was, but it was almost a nighttime storm, farther up, even in our viewing area. That's how slowly the thing was moving. So Rob's absolutely right. It was a daytime storm if you were in Homa. But if you were in Robert, it was a very different experience. I think, I've covered some big ones. Obviously, Katrina's kind of one of the standards. Rita, just a few weeks later, was no asterisk. One of the storms that really sticks out to me is kind of a forgotten storm, and that was Gilbert in 1988, which I covered in the field along the Texas-Mexico border. That had been a Category 5, and at the time it was the strongest storm on record. And this Ida kind of had that sort of feel to it, where you just knew it was serious. And you, David, have been talking since you came back to New Orleans about, we haven't really had a wind event. We haven't really had a wind event, and this one certainly was. I know you spent some time in Miami, and I had covered Hurricane Andrew in Louisiana and had seen the pictures over the years of Homestead, Florida, which was just half the town was virtually obliterated in Hurricane Andrew in '92. And I really never paid much attention to where it was on the coast, even though I'd gone through it a couple of times on my way to the Keys or on my way to the Everglades. And I did a 25th anniversary story about Andrew a number of years ago. And I realized as we were out shooting, we are 7 or 8 miles from the Atlantic Ocean. And this little town, this little city, got that kind of damage. So I thought a lot about Miami and the Miami area, the places south of it, as this thing was coming through. The other quick observation I would make is, the early warning system we have today, of which we're a part of that, but it's the technology, it's the National Hurricane Center, it's all of the media and all of the public officials. If this storm had come through 150 years ago, it would have just torn up or probably more recently than that even, would have torn up these little communities that in some ways would have had no idea that morning it was happening. Rob was down there on the coast, I think that morning, and we were commenting on, this is not that far away and it doesn't look that bad. You can understand how these people in the coastal communities, literally got blindsided by these things.
Yeah,
right,
definitely.
That's a good point, John. We were in Grand Isle the Saturday beforehand, and that morning it was beautiful. I remember making the comment that if you had an ice chest and a chair, it'd be a great day to sit out on the beach and just enjoy this phenomenal weather. and like you said, without knowing, 100 years ago, folks would have been doing that, and then we all know what happened to Grand Isle. So
Well, yeah, and
it would have been incredibly deadly.
Chenier Caminado, which was a community that was, just to the west of Grand Isle, was obliterated in 1893 in a kind of similar sort of circumstance, and had no idea that, even back in those days, even if they knew something was brewing because they could tell the conditions, there was no way to know that was going to hit them.
And back in the day, they depended on those ship reports, and you got to remember, Ida was not a strong storm when it entered the Gulf of Mexico, and it strengthened right at the coast. So it's one of those examples of how a strengthening storm in the Gulf of Mexico. We've seen quite a few of them the past several years, but they're bombing at the coast. It's a totally different storm as compared to something like Rita, which was weakening as it crossed the Gulf.
Let's talk about after the storm, and we're still talking about after the storm. It's now been a month, but let's go back and we'll start with Rob, and then Zach, I want you to get John's perspective. Rob, let's go back to once the storm ended, and I can remember you going into these communities, right after the storm, looking at this damage, videotaping it, and coming back to the station and giving your perspective there at the desk. What were you thinking in the first couple of days after the storms when you started going into these hardest hit communities? I mean, had you seen anything like this before?
We've seen all kinds of tragedy in what we do. So it wasn't something that I didn't expect. It was something that I feared. But the thing that just really impressed me the most about going into these communities was how, at least in my opinion, I knew the first and most immediate need would be housing. The fact that, people were trying to get power back on, obviously, you're trying to get, water and those systems running. That goes without saying. That's going to happen because these companies come in and they do that. And maybe it takes some time for some folks, a month, weeks or whatnot. But to me, the first thing I thought was that all of these people who have lost their homes are going to need houses. They're going to need a place to stay because there were houses that were off of their stilts. There were houses that had roofs completely removed. No blue tarp would ever fix that. However, there were folks down in Homa. I remember going down Grand Coteau Road at one point and meeting these families who were huddled under blankets that were soaked, that they had hung up over the holes in their roof. Not a tarp, but a blanket. And were sleeping together on one bed, 4 of them on one bed, just because that was the one dry spot. They had moved the mattress into the corner. And so these were folks that, didn't necessarily evacuate. Some of them did, some of them, but moved out of that area and came back almost immediately. Because for a lot of these folks in those communities, you're talking about mobile homes, you're talking about RVs, you're talking about people who have invested everything that they have into these communities, and they don't have necessarily the ability to go and stay in a Baton Rouge or go stay in Destin or go to Houston for a week or two, but while they wait for things to come back. They had to go somewhere to a family, a friend's house, a relative, maybe one night in a hotel while the storm came through, and then had nowhere else to go but come back. So we're seeing just this immense amount of damage. And to me, that was the most immediate need. Obviously, the water and the supplies that you need to survive are important. But we're sitting here more than a month after the storm now and still waiting on, not just waiting on, okay, when am I getting my trailer or when am I getting my housing solution? Still waiting on what the solution is going to be for a lot of these folks in some cases. And, that's something that, maybe as you go forward, it's something that communities and municipalities and parishes and the federal government even should have a plan on standby ready to roll within the next few days. Because, what do you need to survive? You need a roof over your head. And everywhere I saw, there was every single community south of I-10 had homes that were unlivable. And, when you do that, and then you have all these linemen coming in, you have all these people coming into the hotels, we were talking about it this morning, there's nowhere for people to stay, even if you could put them in hotels.
I just, from an observational standpoint, I've been to Lafourche Parish, but I have not been to areas outside of the Lafourche Levee District where there's enough damage that I saw just going down Highway 1 to begin with. But I mean, that's a question that I've been kind of wanting to ask, and I don't know how much we've covered it so far. But once again, why is this taking so long to get a response for what we know was going to be needed? A Category 4 storm hitting areas, especially without levee protection, even ones that have levee protection. It's a 150 mile per hour storm. That there's going to be these kind of housing needs. I know there are some shelters that have been opened across the area, but it's unclear really how accessible those are. And there's the concerns that you guys were mentioning that we've been talking about, that people really don't want to leave their property or the areas that are damaged and be far away from it.
Well, sure. I mean, you know, if you wanted to get in a boat and drive from Cutoff to Lafitte, I don't know, 20 minutes, something like that. But it'll take you an hour and a half to get there. And the same thing. I mean, some of these communities are an hour and 25 minutes or so from New Orleans in good traffic. And I can tell you just from being down on Lafourche in the days after the storm, I mean, traffic was just horrendous. And sometimes for good reasons, because, they were bringing in heavy equipment or some very large piece of cleanup apparatus that needs the road to itself. Highway 308 was closed because it seemed to have more debris than Highway 1, which for the most part runs parallel down Bayou Lafourche. So transportation in the early days is really challenging. On top of the fact that gasoline is a problem.
Yeah, that was a really big problem, especially early on, even, across the metropolitan area. We had people that, literally couldn't get to work because of the fuel shortage. But fortunately, at least, for the majority of the area, that's been cleared up. John, any of the damage that you've seen, and we're going to get into the coastal impacts, but just the damage you've seen to people's properties, and what are some of the areas that you've visited since the storm?
I've spent some time in Lower Lafourche, all the way down to Leeville, St. Charles Parish, St. John Parish, Plaquemines. There's a little bit in Madisonville. Madisonville, when you drive through it on the North Shore, appears for the most part like it's kind of normal, but actually there were a number of homes that took on water. So, at St. John Parish and Laplace, of course, Laplace got the winds and the surge. And one of the great ironies is that in another few years, they'll have a hurricane protection system. It just didn't come early enough for them. The other thing that strikes me about this is when you ask, have you seen damage like this before? And the answer is yes, in Michael, a couple of years ago in Florida. But in a way, what's partly fascinating here is Grand Isle sits, parallel to the Gulf of Mexico, or perpendicular, if you want to look at that way, from most of Highway 1. These other communities are right on Highway 1. They're kind of fingers of land, as Rob put it, where they jut out into the Gulf of Mexico. So you didn't have a sideways-facing community that was taking the brunt, except maybe Grand Isle and Port Fourchon. You had communities that go this way, that jut out into the hurricane winds. And I think that, to Rob's point about Homa, I memean, as bad as it is, Homa was just about to get walloped in a way that we probably can't imagine, because it was the winds were still really intense, and there are a whole bunch of people in Homa. We forget sometimes there are 110,000 people, I think it is, in Terrebonne Parish, and most of them live around Homa. And if that storm had not taken that little jog and put parts of metropolitan New Orleans more in harm's way, David, you could speak more to this than I can, but I mean, it was about to obliterate parts of Homa.
Yeah, and I think, Zach, you would agree. I mean, that as much as that shift was, bad for places like Laplace, obviously, and St. Charles Parish, where there's tremendous damage, that shift back to the east, maybe even Thibodaux, that everything from Houma to Gray to Thibodaux, the results would have been a lot worse.
Yeah, because if you think about it, the strongest part of this storm went over Port Fourchon, over portions of Grand Isle, then penetrated inland along LA1. But if you shifted that a little bit west, where that track was kind of all along, just to the south of Houma, and the strongest winds moved up through Terrebonne Bay, all of a sudden nothing's going to stop it until it hits Cocodrie and it hits Homa. And so, I mean, the hardest hit areas were those coastal locations of Grand Island, Port Fourchon. But in the long run, that small shift east, even though the devastation in Homa and Terrebonne Parish is just terrible, they would have taken the brunt of the surge and the strongest winds if that track didn't shift just a little hair east.
Let's talk about. Oh, go ahead, John.
Well, it's interesting that you kind of mentioned that too, because when we were driving back, and we drove, my photographer and I, Steve Wolfram, we drove back kind of in the storm to get back to New Orleans that evening, that back end of the storm, and we immediately could tell where that eye wall on that eastern side had come through. And when John, what you were saying about how Port Fourchon and Grand Isle were perpendicular, the rest of those communities are the fingers. It kind of gave almost an alley of relief in a way, where the marsh was torn up and everything there was torn up, obviously. But up 90, as you're coming through Bayou Gauche, and as you came through des Allemands and going up into Hamville, you could see almost exactly where that eye had torn through, because the damage was so much greater. There was stuff on the road, boats everywhere, and then as you continued on, as we did through the night to New Orleans, you could see, it was still, there was still a lot of damage, but it started to subside as far as the intensity of the amount of damage.
Right.
It was really
the things that
eye-opening to see that.
I was in Bayou Gauche the other day, and they still didn't have power, apparently, at least everybody, because the linemen were there. The other thing, when you get off the 310 onto 90, immediately you're in devastation. I will say, Galliano is a mess. I mean, I don't know exactly where the eye wall was, but Galliano looks like it was right in it. So when I talk about the kind of the fingers of land, they certainly weren't spared in places like Galliano and Golden Meadow. And what happens is the media comes in. You're either going to hit something that's not too far from New Orleans, where your deadline is, maybe even if you're a national media, or you go down to Grand Isle because that's the place to be. And I was pleased that we talked about Galliano on the news last night and this morning, because they really took a beating there. From a weather standpoint, David, to illustrate this point we've been making too about the winds, we always kind of, laymen, we kind of think of sustained winds and the sort of constant sense of the force of the winds. There's a spot in Robert. The storm, I guess, was a Category 2 maybe at that point, but there's an interesting spot in Robert where all these pretty large pine trees have just been sliced in two from straight line winds, where it looked like a buzzsaw came through. But about an eighth maybe, or a quarter mile away, there's an RV sales place, a business, and they had one trailer knocked over. So, my thought when I saw those trees a couple days later was, wow, the RV place must have really taken a beating. And, a trailer knocked over is not a good thing, but it's not 60 trailers knocked over. So they were very close to one another in proximity.
Well, and you can get variations in wind speeds in relatively short distances, also with a storm like Ida. And I think, Zach, you can chime in on this as well, that we had the concentric eye walls that were developing with Ida as it made landfall. And then as it went through that eye wall replacement cycle, it actually expanded the breadth of the sustained winds with the storm, and that's what I think allowed for even more damage, especially in Tangipahoa Parish, also because of the eastward shift that we saw in the storm. We can also see the way you describe the damage doesn't sound like it could have been a tornado. It sounds like it was straight line winds, but sometimes you can get these areas of stronger rotation in the outer eye wall of the hurricane.
Yeah, they were all going in the same direction, the trees.
Yeah, and to get on your point about the concentric eye walls, one thing people probably see as these storms go inland is, it's stronger because the winds are stronger and the farther duration. But when you have those concentric eye walls, the wind field is going to expand. That's what made Katrina's wind field get so big, is it went through its rapid deepening phase in the Gulf, and then it started its weakening aspect, but its wind field expanded. Ida was strengthening up until the coast, and the wind field was expanding. It also ran into land, so it should start to weaken. But that expanding wind field, it makes a huge difference in how those impacts are felt all across a certain area, and not just right in that eye wall.
All right, I want to get into, guys, the economic impacts and the environmental ones going forward, and really the two are really intertwined. When you talk about the environment in coastal Louisiana, you're also usually talking about the economics of it. Let's start with the seafood industry. And Rob, do you have a feeling about how long it might take some of these fishing communities to recover? Could some of them not recover? Could some of them be forced to move to other areas along the coast? What have you seen so far?
Yeah, I mean, you talk about fishermen, shrimpers, crabbers, those kind of guys. I mean, I met multiple shrimpers who didn't have a boat anymore. I met a guy that had just spent $20,000 on brand new crab traps, and all of them were ruined. I mean, these are people that get this money and they make an investment, and they don't necessarily have a company or an investment firm behind them. They don't necessarily always have insurance on that sort of thing. They kind of live hand to mouth as they go out, on the water. It's what they love, and when you're out there, you really get it. Why they love it so much, because it's beautiful and it's pristine and it's peaceful, and seafood is so good. So I mean, and so there was this one guy in particular that I met, Tommy Tizer, met him down in Dularge, and he was just such a magnanimous dude. Just welcomed you in, gave us a free tank of gas, didn't want anything for it, wanted to introduce us to his dog, but was telling me that his boat had been damaged. He was going to try to figure out some way to fix that. His generator on the boat had been damaged. But all he wanted to do was go out and go catch some shrimp. And it was maybe last week he sent me a picture that he got a catch. The question though is twofold, because you have these guys who fish, guys and girls who fish, and and so there's the people that are going to go out there, but also the actual shrimp themselves. What happened to them? The crabs themselves. We're in Lafitte, and all these blue crabs are just stuck in this mud, suffocating. Nowhere to go. They can't move. There was this cute little girl there that we met who was actually saving the crabs and throwing them back into the water. But one of the guys there was telling me that he was worried because the water probably still didn't have a lot of oxygen in it because of everything that was coming in. So those crabs likely were still going to die. So you have the catch itself. How did it fare through all of this? How long does it take to come back? Let alone you think about oysters. Were they damaged? That what happened with them? And then the folks that go out and catch it, either they're working to rebuild their community or they don't have a boat anymore. We went to several harbors that these are boats that $50,000, $200,000. They sink their life savings, their life work into these boats, and they're upside down. The rigging is knotted up with another boat. They'll work to try and salvage what they can, and there were some boats that were okay, but this is a fleet. And this is what the amount of seafood that we get here in New Orleans and across the Southeast relies on this fleet and relies on every single one of those people doing what they normally do that we never see, that we never know. We're never there on the docks watching them go in and day out. And now, you got to think like at least 50% of these folks were affected in some way or another, and they're not fishing for one reason or another. So when does that come back? How does it come back? I mean, I think you already kind of see it in some restaurants in town that don't have oysters, that don't have some fresh shrimp and stuff like that. So certainly that's a huge impact that I think a lot of us are just starting to feel. There wasn't a lot of demand for shrimp in that week or two after, but there's going to be here soon, and how do we replace it? How do we fix it? Will those folks get payments from FEMA to replace their boats? Will insurance pay out for that kind of stuff? That's all stuff that those are the kind of things that the red tape that these are guys that are ready to hook up a fishing pole and go. They're not sitting around trying to cut red tape, and they've got a lot of red tape to get through before they get back out on the water.
I think Zach, I'm going to have you start to ask John some about the coastline and the impacts there. But before that, John, I want to ask you about Grand Isle. I've had a lot of folks outside of the New Orleans area that don't live in our region. They know about Grand Isle. It's a popular place to visit. A lot of people that come to Louisiana to fish. It's a popular destination. They've seen the pictures out of Grand Isle. They want to know, Is Grand Isle going to be rebuilt, or is this going to be it?
It's, as I said, kind of at the top, this is a life-changing decision for Grand Isle. So what is Grand Isle? Grand Isle is a mix of camps, some people of some means sometimes, who've either had it in the family for a few generations now, maybe, or a couple, or who, let's face it, some rich dude who's got a big, pristine camp on Grand Isle. And then there are people who actually live there, many people who, as a percentage of the structures, and it really gets down to individual choices that people are going to have to make about whether they want to do this again. I mean, there will be a Grand Isle. What percentage of it will come back? I don't know. There's a tourism industry on Grand Isle. The hotels are damaged. They have to be rebuilt. Rob talked about the fishing. There are three, I believe, in that from Leeville, from Golden Meadow South, I believe there are three of what they call shrimp shacks, which are where the shrimpers bring their catch. There's an infrastructure to the seafood industry, just as there is to any other industry, and these were all out of commission. I'm told the one on Grand Isle is committed to coming back. The other ones, I haven't checked on them. There's one in Port Fourchon, and then another one just as you go through the floodgate and the levee into the unprotected area. Again, it's obliterated. So one of the immediate concerns is how many places do these shrimpers have once they get back out there to bring their catch to? I'm sure that the market will take care of that eventually, but it's going to be a little bit like a Katrina thing, except it won't have the degree of help necessarily that the destruction of a major city had 16 years ago.
And to kind of jump on that point about Grand Isle is, it was obliterated for Katrina too. There was a huge surge that impacted, and I'm one of the examples of, I had a camp in my family for generations, and I no longer have a camp in my family after Katrina, just because you couldn't afford to rebuild. So like John was saying, there's different levels of, you have your residents are probably going to end up coming back. The camp life, that might be one of those transition periods where some of the land goes up for sale and whatnot. But John, you spent many, decades now looking at the Louisiana coastline, and you had a segment this morning talking about with Wendell Curall, which was on the podcast just a week or so ago, talking about the marsh grass and how it's all just been pushed up towards the levees in Lafourche Parish. But that's not only in Lafourche, it's in Lafitte. Rob was talking about the mud in Lafitte and in Terrebonne Parish. Is it too early to kind of figure out how much marsh has been lost from this storm? Is this going to take a huge toll on what our coastal restoration projects were doing and how much progress we were making? Have you been able to take any kind of look at that, so to speak?
Sure. The best view right now is really by satellite. And the short answer is that I think you could say safely, there appears to be some pretty good evidence from satellite pictures that Ida appears to have caused significant damage, as Brady Kubion from the U.S. Geological Survey put it. The caveat is that in the weeks and months after a storm, all that mud that's out there in the marsh kind of gets pushed around. Sometimes the wave action, the tides will push it back up into certain places. Grasses take root and marsh gets rebuilt. But the short answer is it does appear, especially in the areas of western Barataria, to a certain degree along the western part of Lake Pontchartrain, but especially in Barataria Bay, and then maybe even over on the, to some smaller degree on the western side of the Lafourche levees, there would be some pretty serious damage, and that's probably not coming back. That marsh grass, I don't know where the name comes from, to be honest with you, but they call that rack, that brown, just massive amount of square miles of marsh grass. It's doing a couple of things. It's making it really difficult for people in places like Lafitte to get around and clean up. They've got to get it off the levee in Lafourche. But what it's also doing is it's lying on marsh, living marsh in places, and it will suffocate that marsh and cause even more degradation. I think at the end of the day, if you were to go back 6 months from now and look at a satellite, it probably isn't quite as bad as it looks by satellite today, because things will get moved around a little bit. But this may, it's pretty close perhaps, and it's I mean, it's square miles of marsh that we appear to have lost.
Let me ask you about the area you're talking about, also around Lake Salvador, and for those
Mm-hmm.
that are listening and not familiar with our local landscape, we have Lake Pontchartrain, which is the very large lake that a lot of people may be familiar with, that sits on the north side of the New Orleans area. But we also have this other large body of water, Lake Salvador. How significant is the loss of land or marsh just south of New Orleans, particularly around this area?
I checked yesterday, I think it was, along sort of the northwestern shore of Lake Salvador, and you can see where there, at least at the moment, there are pools of water. Now, that may be an area where things might get filled in a little bit as the tides push, the Gulf's force is from the southeast, and from the south generally, and it will push some material back in perhaps, so we'll see about that. There's another little body of water called Little Lake, which is kind of south, even a little bit farther south. And I mean, and a couple of bayous that used to be bayous and now they look like long lakes. There's just a little bit of land that separates those two bayous that are in the Lafitte area. I mean, you kind of look at it and wonder, David, if it's not the the beginning of the end for those, for that section of land where these bodies eventually are going to become one. That's happened obviously in some other places. Hurricanes, are a lot of times we have enough in the way of coastal projects that in some years we actually build more land now than we lose. But this year, it's pretty obvious that we will have lost more land in 2021 than we gained.
Well, that goes into what I was going to follow up with next, John, is that we've had four significant hurricanes in the last 12 months. Okay, we're not talking about in the last year, the Louisiana coastline, pretty much the entire coastline has been hit. Laura, Delta, Zeta, and of course Ida, and Laura and Ida tied for the most intense hurricanes on record, with the last island storm at 150 miles per hour at landfall. I was going to ask you, what does that mean for coastal restoration projects? You kind of summarized it there, but is this going to be, do we know yet how much of a setback it is, not just for land loss, but also for the projects themselves?
Well, some of the projects, and it's really kind of too early. I've looked on satellite. The satellites that we can look at on a kind of a day-to-day basis aren't like looking on Google Earth. Like they don't have the kind of resolution where you can just come in and go and look extensively at one island. But just in looking at kind of a wider view, Queen Bess, which was a project that got a lot of attention last year near Grand Isle, that appears as though it has a little pooling of water. Appears to be so. I've heard from some people at the Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority and Wildlife and Fisheries that they think it is going to be okay. The shoreline seems to have held up. And that's generally true of some of the other projects, some of the other coastal projects, the high profile ones and otherwise. They seem to have held up okay. They actually put a lot of effort into barrier island restoration now, because 30, 40 years ago, they would go out and build a barrier island, spend millions of dollars, a storm would come through and it would obliterate it. And now what they've learned is that there are ways to design shoreline protection, maybe with some rocks. They do a marsh area, which acts as sort of a backstop, so that when the sand moves, it moves back on, and the island sort of rolls onto itself. So through some luck, some circumstance, and some design, some of these projects seem to have done okay. But most of the coast is not some artificial man-made project. Most of the coast is marsh and ridges and whatnot. A lot of what was lost in Lafourche Parish, in that area, what you're seeing in some of the more dramatic satellite images, is what they call Floton Marsh. It's actually floating marsh that you have to be very careful when you step in it, because you might find yourself going down six feet. And a lot of that is pretty fragile. From what some of the people who know the coast tell me, maybe it was pulled up, roots and all, and pushed now as some of that marsh grass that you see on the levees and in the wetlands. We'll know more as time goes on. Probably another couple of months will tell us more. But every early indication is that it's a big loss.
Yeah, and I'm going to try to jump over to Rob because Rob, you saw Grand Isle before the storm, you saw Grand Isle after the storm,
Right.
and you touched on this earlier about the housing issue that's not only along the coast, it's inland, it's Homa, it's Thibodaux, it's up through St. Charles Parish. I mean, I know there's been some new information coming out this week about housing and possibility of trailers going on properties. Do you think that we're about to see that progress, even though we're over a month after the storm?
Yeah, I think so. I know that the state has been really, pushing hard to try and get the trailers, the RVs. You think back to Katrina, you remember all of those trailers that were out and about. They created these sites where you would have 50, 100, 200 trailers potentially where people could go and live. But the ideal solution would be to give a family a trailer that they can put in their front yard or put in their driveway while they fix their house up until that's all said and done, because then it is a permanent, semi-permanent really spot for them to live. The state has been pushing. Governor John Bel Edwards is saying how much he has been pushing FEMA almost daily to get this going. He expressed a bunch of disappointment in how long it's taken to provide similar accommodations after Laura last year. So he said that it seems as though this time around it's going a little bit quicker, but it's still more than a month unacceptable for a lot of folks. You hear the parish president saying the same thing. So what's happening, I think, on the local level and the state level really is they're pushing forward. And now we hear, I believe, John, you can correct me if I'm wrong, that the FEMA is going to pay for 90% of these trailers that are coming down
Right.
at a certain point. Now, who qualifies for that? What you need to do. The other issue is, they want these trailers to be hooked into a sewer line. They want them to be hooked into water and power. So, do you have that at your property? Can you actually take it? That's it's interesting, and then it just kind of makes you think about all the things that go on after that. You think back to Katrina. I mean, I was at LSU at the time, and I was doing stories about these fields that were filled with these Katrina trailers over at LSU for years. That and then what happened with them afterward becomes a question. So it's it. I think there's still so many unanswered questions there. It's a little bit baffling that there isn't this is what we do for this. And it seems as though people are scrambling to try and figure out what we're doing now. But I do think that some people are going to begin to see a little bit of relief on that front. So if you're someone who has a house that has been obliterated and you are rebuilding on your property, and you do have the wherewithal to make those connections to utilities, hopefully those folks will begin to see the ability to get those trailers. I know the application process is already open, and we provided all that information as well, on our website for folks that still need to apply to get that. It's just, when I think about it, and I was talking about this with my photographer coming back. I mean, not only do you have all of these structures now that need to be brought in, and then connected to utilities, but just the massive amount of wood that you're going to need to rebuild homes, the massive amount of roofing components, windows, doors. I mean, you need everything. Think about what's in a house. You need everything for a lot of these communities. And we were already in a crunch, in a squeeze to get most of these supplies for just folks that were building random homes. I have a friend who's building a home in Gulf Shores, and he waited 6 months, 8 months to get just the windows for his house. It wasn't that he couldn't afford it. It was just that the company that makes the windows has so much demand. So that's my fear right now, is that, like, okay, yes, we put these trailers on people's properties, but how long until they're in actual homes again? Because the supply chain has just been decimated by COVID. Let alone the fact that now there's this huge need for all of these supplies here in Southeast Louisiana and beyond. Who gets precedent? Where does it come from? There's a boon to one portion of the economy for this, but at the same time, like, can they even get their hands on the supplies to begin to sell these, to begin to provide them to these contractors that really have a lot of work to do.
Well, there's a boon to the economy, but there's in a sense that you have certain businesses that always benefit, but the economists call that the theory of the broken window. If you have a perfectly good window and it gets broken, you may replace it with a better window, but you still have a loss. And this is a very serious economic hit. I do think on a brighter note, I know you had Wendell Curall from the Levee District in South Lafourche on last week, and I know you both made the point that at least they didn't have surge, because 25 years ago this would have meant massive flooding, and it would have cost, ironically enough, the flood insurance program a lot more money. And the other thing it would have done is it would have cost the homeowners, because they would have been in a fight, as people were in Katrina, with their insurance company about whether something was caused by wind damage or was caused by surge, and which came first. And that gives a lease on life to some communities, depending on how individuals make decisions about how where they find employment, whether they feel like doing this again. There's been a sort of a move up Lafourche Parish into the more northern communities over a period of decades and really generations now. At least this very critical test for the levees, the South Lafourche Levee District, I think you have to say passed in that regard. Flood insurance, what's flood insurance going to be? People don't really know, and that's going to have an effect on these communities in the long term unless Congress intervenes in some way. So there are a lot of unanswered questions.
Well, the bottom line is we're going to be here to cover this story in the days, the months, and the years that follow, just like what happened after Katrina, because that's how long the impacts are going to last, just by what we've been discussing here. I want to thank both of you guys for coming on again today, and for those people out there listening that aren't in the New Orleans television market, this is what local news is all about. This is about local knowledge and experience. John Snell and Rob Krieger, both a wealth of both of these, and really just assets to the community. This is what we need in all local television markets, are guys like you and gals, of course, of which we have plenty of that going on at Fox 8. So let's hope for better days ahead. We got a few more weeks to go here in the season. And as Zach and I were talking about at the beginning of the podcast, all is quiet for now, and we don't see anything on the horizon. So John and Rob, thanks for being here today.
No, thanks very much, Rob. Did you pay him for those nice comments?
I was wondering. I was like, "Dang, David, that's the nice thing you ever said about me."
Actually,
I was gonna say that we got a lot of compliments about you two out in the field. Zach, the community loves you. They like you too, David. We got a lot of comments about Zach. I think the logo should say the David Bernard Podcast with Zach Fredella. So.
That could be in the works. I didn't want this to turn into a backslapping event here, but I will also say I'm not lying about this. My mother loves John Snell and Rob Krieger. Okay, she's in the Houston area, but watches. She has a very good eye for talent. I will say that. And she's like, that reporter that keeps coming back, the one who's dirty. He is doing a great job. I'm like, Mom, he hasn't been able to shower. We're kind of in the middle.
I wore
of this
two shirts. I had two shirts all week. That's all.
But anyway, she's a big fan. Guys, thanks again for being on the
podcast.
podcast.
TMI. Anyway, thank you, David. Thank you, Zach. Thank you, Rob.
Thanks, y'all. Y'all are great.
Well, I wasn't joking when I said we're really lucky to have great reporters like John and Rob, because local knowledge is so important. When you talk about a disaster of this magnitude, Zach, it encompasses so many different levels.
It really does. And, for the past 40 minutes talking to John and Rob, there were so many points that were hit on, and it just goes to show you the example of we had the pre-storm event, we had the storm event, now we're in the post-storm event, and then we're going to slowly transition to this phase of something totally new, where this is going to have impacts for not only weeks, not only years, some decades. And there's so many different facets to a storm recovery that has to do with, our coastline, that has to do with people's lives and people's livelihoods. The industries down there, we all know what Port Fourchon means to Lafourche Parish. And so all of these things are going to have to come together, and they're all going to have to adapt to some type of new normal in the long run. Because some areas are not ever going to be the same as what they were before Ida, just like Katrina. Some areas still haven't recovered from Katrina, while other areas that it's been expanded and they're flourished after Katrina. So that's how these storms work. They're not just some point on a map where it hurricanes for a few hours and there's a whole bunch of loss and then we recover in a month. This is going to take a lot of time, and there's a lot of different facets to that storm recovery that we don't know how it's all going to play out. But like you said in the podcast earlier, that we're going to be here for the long haul.
Yeah, definitely. And one thing we'll want to consider going forward is how we cover these communities and the length of time that it's going to take them to pull out of this storm. We still don't know exactly how all that's going to look, but certainly here at Fox 8, we're going to be here to cover it at all levels, online, and of course with our podcasts and on all our newscasts as well, because this is going to be an ongoing story that we're going to be talking about, as you said, from years to come. Again, a reminder that you can watch this podcast at fox8live.com/David if you're listening to it. If you're watching it and you found it on our website, you can listen to it on all your normal podcast apps, and we have the audio version also on fox8live.com/David. For Zach Fradella, I'm David Bernard. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time on the podcast.